All right, so we're diving into a question I bet you've had before. Why don't Indonesians speak Dutch? I mean, they were under Dutch rule for centuries.
It's a really good question. You'd think Dutch would be like, English in India or something.
Exactly. But it turns out the answer is way more complicated than you might think.
It is. It's a really interesting story, full of surprises.
It really is. So to set the scene, we're talking about Indonesia, a massive chain of islands with hundreds of languages, ruled by the Dutch for centuries. And yet, no Dutch.
Yeah, it really challenges how we usually think about language and colonization.
Mhm.
Usually the colonizer's language takes over,
Mhm.
but something totally different happened here.
Yeah, how do we even begin to untangle this?
Well, I think a good place to start is with the Dutch East India Company.
The VOC.
Exactly. Now, these guys were different from other colonizers. They weren't really interested in spreading their language or culture. They definitely weren't there for, spreading religion or anything like that.
Right, they were all about the money.
Oh, yeah. The VOC was basically a giant corporation laser-focused on one thing: profit.
Especially from the spice trade.
Oh, absolutely. Those spices were worth a fortune. And it's way cheaper than forcing everyone to learn your language.
I'm guessing using a language that's already widely spoken.
You got it. The VOC was all about efficiency, so they decided to adopt Malay, which was already pretty common across the islands.
So this was like setting the stage for the whole linguistic puzzle right from the beginning. But wasn't Malay already spoken pretty widely before the Dutch even showed up?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, think about it. You got an archipelago with over 400 languages. People needed a way to communicate.
It's a lot of languages. So Malay was already like the go-to for trade and everyday chatter.
Exactly. It was already woven into the fabric of Indonesian society. And way back in the 7th century, we're talking about the powerful Malacca Sultanate. They had already established Malay as a key trading language.
So the VOC basically saw a good thing and was like, yeah, let's just use that.
Pretty much. Why reinvent the wheel, right?
Makes sense. Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting to me. Eventually, the Dutch government took direct control in 1800. You'd think then they'd push their own language right.
Yeah, you would. They did make some attempts to introduce Dutch education,
Yeah.
but it was super limited.
How so?
Well, they mainly focused on the local elite,
Yeah.
hoping to create a small class of Dutch speakers.
Mm-hmm.
But even then, things didn't always go according to plan.
Really? Like, what happened?
There are actually some pretty fascinating stories from that time. Take Kartini, for example. She was an Indonesian women's rights activist. And even though she came from a privileged background and received a Dutch education, she actually wrote about Dutch officials refusing to speak Dutch with her. Could you believe that?
No way. Even the elite who learned Dutch weren't really encouraged to use it.
It's pretty wild, right?
Right.
It just shows you that the Dutch had a very specific agenda.
So even when the Dutch were in charge, they weren't exactly like handing out Dutch lessons to everyone.
Not really. For the vast majority of Indonesians, access to Dutch education was basically non-existent.
That's crazy. So was there like something else going on that made them hesitate to push their language?
Well, I think if we zoom out a little and look at the bigger picture, there's a really fascinating piece of the puzzle here. You see, the Dutch had this whole system for classifying the Indonesian population,
Sure.
and it kind of backfired in a way that would change everything.
Okay. I'm all ears. What was this system?
So basically, they divided the population into 3 groups: Dutch, foreign Easterners, and inlanders.
Inlanders. That doesn't sound so great.
Yeah, it wasn't. It was basically lumping all native Indonesians together, regardless of their ethnicity or their language or their culture.
So they're trying to divide the population even more.
That was the intention. But here's the unintended consequence. By throwing everyone into this inlander bucket, the Dutch accidentally gave them a shared identity.
So this attempt to divide them actually ended up uniting them.
Exactly. And think about it. When the Dutch consistently used Malay to communicate with all these inlanders, right, they unintentionally reinforced the idea that Malay, not Dutch, was the language of belonging in Indonesia.
It's like they were making themselves the outsiders by doing that.
In a way, they were. And Malay became the language that connected people, the language that represented who they were as a people, not who the Dutch wanted them to be. And that's where the story of Indonesian nationalism really kicks off.
So as resentment toward colonial rule grew, this shared inlander identity forged through Malay really laid the groundwork for a new national consciousness.
Yeah, exactly. This brings us to a really pivotal moment in Indonesia's journey, the 1928 Youth Congress in Jakarta.
I Ah, yes, the 1928 Youth
So
Congress.
this was a huge gathering of young Indonesian nationalists from all over the archipelago. And it was here that they made this really powerful declaration: one motherland, one nation, and one language.
And that language was Indonesian, a standardized form of Malay. It wasn't just a coincidence, right? They were deliberately choosing to unify under a language that was already tied to this shared identity.
Exactly. They weren't just looking for any language. They wanted one that could bridge all those cultural differences and create a true sense of unity. Something completely separate from Dutch rule.
I've got a question, though. If the goal was to unify the nation, why not go with Javanese?
Oh, that's a good question. Javanese was already spoken by almost half the population back then.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, the nationalists were actually incredibly forward-thinking. They knew that choosing a language spoken mainly by one group could actually create divisions instead of unity.
That makes sense.
They needed a language that everyone could embrace, a language that wouldn't alienate anyone.
So Indonesian emerges as the symbol of this new national unity, a language for a nation fighting to break free. But then World War II happens and the Japanese occupy Indonesia. What happened to the language landscape then?
Well, this is where things take another really unexpected turn. You might think the Japanese would force their own language on everyone, or at least switch back to Dutch. But get this. They chose to administer the country in Indonesian.
Seriously, the Japanese promoting Indonesian.
I know, right? It seems totally counterintuitive.
It really does.
But if you think about it from their perspective, it makes a weird kind of sense.
Okay, I'm listening.
They needed to communicate with the Indonesian people somehow, right? And Indonesian, with its growing association with national unity and resistance against colonialism, was the perfect tool.
So by using Indonesian, they actually ended up giving it even more legitimacy, even though their goal was obviously to maintain control.
Exactly. Their propaganda, their policies, all designed to serve their own interests, actually ended up breathing even more life into the Indonesian language. It's really ironic when you think about it.
So they basically shot themselves in the foot.
Kind of, yeah. And they even went so far as to release key Indonesian nationalist figures like Sukarno from Dutch prisons.
Ugh. Sukarno, the father of Indonesian independence. He must have been pretty happy about that.
Oh yeah, Sukarno was a brilliant strategist. He saw the Japanese occupation as an opportunity, however unintended, to advance his vision of an independent Indonesia with Indonesian as its heart. And he used every platform the Japanese gave him to rally the people using Indonesian as the language of liberation.
So in a way, the Japanese played right into his hands.
Pretty much. Yeah. And after the war ended, Indonesia fought hard for its independence, finally achieving it in 1949. And with Sukarno as president, there was no question about what the national language would be: Indonesian.
And that pretty much sealed the fate of Dutch in Indonesia. It faded into the background as Indonesian took center stage. What a story. It's amazing how a language that started as a tool of colonial administration ended up becoming the symbol of a nation's struggle for freedom.
It really is. It shows the power of language, how it can be reclaimed and reshaped to fit the needs and dreams of a people.
It's a really powerful reminder that language isn't just about words, right? It's about power and identity and belonging.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like it's woven into who we are.
Exactly. So we've traced the decline of Dutch and the rise of Indonesian, but I want to dive a little deeper into like the specifics of Indonesian success. How did it actually manage to unify such a diverse population? Was it really just about picking a standardized version of Malay?
Well, that was a big part of it, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, having that foundation in Malay definitely gave Indonesian a head start.
Right.
But think of it this way. Imagine you're creating a brand new currency for a country. You wouldn't just like hand out random pieces of gold and silver, right?
Okay, I'm following.
You'd need a standardized system that everyone understands and can use regardless of their background.
Right, like a common system.
Exactly. That's basically what they did with Indonesian.
So Indonesian was like the new standardized currency for communication. Got it.
Exactly.
But standardizing a language across a giant archipelago with so many regional variations, that must have been a huge project.
Oh, it was a massive undertaking. It involved creating a unified grammar and establishing a standard vocabulary. They even had to develop a whole new writing system.
Wait, really? I thought Malay already had a written form.
It did, but it used all these different scripts, some based on Arabic, others unique to certain regions. To make Indonesian truly accessible, they chose to adopt the Latin alphabet, which was already familiar because of Dutch.
So even though Dutch faded away as a spoken language, its influence lived on in the written form of Indonesian. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it is. It's like these two languages are forever linked. even though one ended up overshadowing the other.
This whole deep dive has been full of surprises. Honestly, who knew that a corporation's obsession with making money centuries ago would have such a huge impact on a nation's language?
It really is a fascinating example of how history is full of these unintended consequences. The VOC's laser focus on the bottom line, choosing the cheapest and most efficient way to communicate well, that set off a chain of events that ultimately led to the decline of Dutch and the rise of Indonesian.
And it wasn't just the VOC, right? It was the Dutch government's policies, the rise of Indonesian nationalism, even the Japanese occupation. It was like a perfect storm of factors that created this unique outcome.
Yeah, exactly. And what I find particularly interesting is that the Dutch, even as colonial rulers, they never seemed that invested in making their language dominant.
Yeah, it's like they totally missed the memo that language is so deeply connected to
It's
identity.
like they just didn't get it by not recognizing that they basically created the perfect conditions for Indonesian to take root and grow.
And in doing so, Indonesian became way more than just a language. It became like the voice of a nation, a symbol of unity and strength in the face of adversity.
Absolutely. It's a story that really makes us rethink our assumptions about colonialism and language, and it reminds us that history is full of these unexpected twists and turns.
We've covered so much ground today, but I'm curious what stands out to you as like the most surprising or thought-provoking part of this whole linguistic tale.
You know what really gets me is the irony of the Japanese occupation. Here's this foreign power with its own imperial ambitions, and yet they unintentionally play a key role in solidifying Indonesian as the language of an independent nation.
Yeah.
It just goes to show that history is full of surprises.
Absolutely. It makes you wonder what other unexpected linguistic landscapes are out there just waiting to be discovered. So to our listener, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity about the power of language and the often surprising ways it shapes our world. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and who knows what linguistic mysteries you might uncover.
Well said. It's been a pleasure exploring this with you.
Likewise. Thanks for joining us on this journey.